I'm a believer in global cooperation because I believe that the world faces very grave but solvable crises such as human-induced climate change or the remaining poverty in the midst of wealth or the dangerous misuses of technology, and that we need cooperation to solve these problems. So I recoil when I see the United States or other countries trying to divide the world rather than to create a cooperative framework. Now, I've been engaged in international policy and politics for more than 40 years now. I've worked in more than 140 countries around the world. I know world leaders. I've advised 3 Secretaries General of the United Nations. I believe that the period we're in now is more dangerous and more fraught with deep crisis than at any time in our modern history. We are closer to nuclear war than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. I also know, because I've lived through it, studied it, written books about it, that the United States government, which is the government of the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful military in the world, the only country that has a military force that is with bases in more than 80 countries around the world, 800 military bases overseas from the United States, with a history of overthrowing governments through covert operations, which I've studied at length or seen with my own eyes in some sense. I know that the United States is not providing that cooperative framework, even though it is the most powerful country and it has a great responsibility to the world to act much better than it's acting right now.
But don't you think that, as Leo Strauss in the Chicago School has taught for generations, that if you don't use your power, then you'll lose your power? Isn't that a basic premise of how power relations work? And isn't what you're talking about potentially naive about how power works?
There are 2 theories of politics in Western culture. One goes back to Aristotle, and Aristotle's idea is that politics is for the common good. He wrote a very wonderful book about that called The Politics, 2,300 years ago. Its companion volume is called The Ethics, or the Nicomachean Ethics. The second theory of politics is by Machiavelli, written in its first draft in the 1510s. The prince says that politics is a game of power, and the role of the prince is to hold power. So we have 2 different images of politics: politics to solve problems and politics to maintain and manipulate power. I am an Aristotelian. I believe that politics should be for the common good. Is it? Sometimes yes, very often no. The fact that it is often the mere crass, cynical manipulation of power doesn't make Aristotle wrong. He was a philosopher saying what we should do if we want to have the kind of lives that we aim to have. Machiavelli may be descriptively more accurate at many times, but that doesn't mean we have to settle for that. That just tells us, if we settle for it, that we're doomed. I mentioned President Kennedy earlier as an inspiration for me. President Kennedy, in his great speech on peace in 1963, said, we should not believe that we are gripped by forces that we cannot control. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. And he says man has often solved the seemingly unsolvable problem, and he said in that speech that he believed that we could do it again. So this is a question of not how politics is, but how it should be and how it can be. And people can say this is naive. I think it's naive to follow a power politics that leads us to the nuclear abyss. how much more naive can that be? Naive relative to everything we say we want. I won't tolerate that in the sense of sitting still and saying, well, that's just how politics are. We blow up the world. No way. As long as I have a voice and energy and knowledge of what's going on, I will call out such cynical and crass behavior. And do I believe that if you don't use power, you lose it? Well, as you can see, I'm not so interested in power per se. I'm interested in peace. I'm interested in security. I'm interested in economic well-being. I'm interested in environmental sustainability. I am not interested in power per se. Power is a zero or negative sum game. Who's on top? Who's being hurt? Who can beat the hell out of whom? Those are relatively uninteresting questions. They are questions that children ask in the sandbox when they're 5 years old, but they're not the questions that should dominate our political leaders who supposedly are grown people, though they often don't behave like it.
In your work, you rarely, if ever, touch on religion. Where does an economist like yourself stand with respect to drawing on any religious traditions? Or is your position, you're a globalist, a peacemaker, that religions have a part, but in terms of just politics making, you really negotiate with philosophical principles or economic principles?
I am in fact working with many religious leaders and am very inspired by them. I am an academician of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, and I'm profoundly inspired by Pope Francis and by his two powerful encyclicals, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. Laudato Si says, and Pope Francis is very clear, that our interdependence obliges us to think of a common plan for our common home. And Fratelli Tutti is a wondrous document that says, in order to have peace, we need to encounter the other. The whole encyclical is based on the Good Samaritan, the parable of Jesus describing helping someone from another community, a Samaritan, no less. And he describes what the Good Samaritan does to save this person that's injured in the road, actually getting them care and then paying for their keep. And his message is that we need to encounter the other, otherwise we will be led to false hatreds, we will be led to self-destruction. I meet regularly with Patriarch Bartholomew, His All Holiness of the Orthodox Church, who led so much of the world in the environmental movement in recent decades. So these messages of great religious leaders are moral messages that touch us in the deepest way and are foundational in our cultural perspectives. But it's those leaders who are not being listened to right now by the political leaders who follow the Machiavellian line, who don't think about the common good, who don't think about the dangers of their citizens, who regard lives as fodder, who think that the big question is to weaken Russia through war, and many other things that I know that the U.S. government is involved in, because it says so, actually. What's remarkable also is that as much as the U.S. government lies, it occasionally tells the truth and lets out that bit, but when it does, it's quickly corrected. I can mention, for example, that in February of 2022, when President Biden met with Chancellor Scholz, he said that if Russia invades, the Nord Stream pipeline will be finished. And a reporter said, well, how can you do that? That's a Russian-German pipeline. And Biden said, we have our ways. And then when the pipeline is blown up, the Western press is, well, I wonder who did that. Probably it's the Russians blowing up their own pipeline. And the U.S. government, yeah, it's probably the Russians, even though the Americans have the motive, the means, and actually announced that they would do this very thing. But we're supposed to be stupid, according to Western propaganda. We're supposed to be easily manipulated. And when I made these basic points that it was the United States that warned that the pipeline would be finished, I was yanked off the air of a major U.S. Television program, because you're not supposed to say those things on the U.S. media. So this is really the issue. Religious leaders have an enormous amount to tell us, but our political leaders are arrogant and playing with fire and believing in the Machiavellian line that their highest purpose is maintaining power. Frankly, when I'm told that by a politician, yeah, but that would be really unpopular, I don't know if I'd win re-election, it may be the right thing to do, but would be unpopular, the first thing that I think is, who cares whether you're re-elected? Your job is to help the common good. That is the essence of your responsibility as a politician. You should follow that line.
So what is your take on societies that ended up in a more dependent development role? And do you think that crippled them in terms of how they've developed economically over the past 40 years?
Basically, an economy's place in the world economy depends on many things, but it depends very much on its technological development, its education levels, its capacity to innovate, and therefore to be part of a cutting-edge world economy. And a country like the Czech Republic or Poland or Hungary or others absolutely has the capacity not to be a dependent economy selling